All right, hello, Father's House Church. I am Gordon, back with another episode of Beyond the Message. And I'm joined today by our speaker, Pastor Josh.
Hello.
And our resident other pastor, Josh. Pastor Josh, how are you? Welcome to the podcast. I'm good. It is good to have you here.
Thank you.
At both the church and the podcast. Maybe if you wanted to just take a second, introduce yourself. I don't know that people know you.
Sure. My name is Josh Tanzola. I'm taking over the care and online responsibilities at the church. I'll be working with the teams. I'm also married to Carrie, another one of our staff pastors. So.
Awesome. Well, great. Welcome. And yeah, we're here to talk about Josh's message yesterday. Bless up, number 4. Don't fear giving is kind of what I subtitled it, because I'm creative like that.
It's a good title.
Thank you, Josh. What do you think of your message?
Yeah, I thought it was pretty good. It's always I've preached the post Thanksgiving message before. Always a weird week to be prepping a sermon.
Yeah,
but we made it happen. I was happy with it. I felt like I was clear, to the point.
Yeah,
I think it was a challenging message, both for myself and for the church. So yeah,
definitely challenging. I really liked kind of how you focused in on fear and just more faith in general, and obviously applied to giving ultimately, but just how that fear will hinder our faith and really stop it from going. Especially, I think the part that stuck out to me the most when you were talking about the sowing and the reaping, it was a really good perspective that I don't think we think about a lot, which was that idea of holding on to it.
Yeah.
And how that we can rationalize it like, oh, I'm saving it or whatever. But when you put it in that context of reaping and sowing, like, it's essentially you're letting it just die. And I thought that was a really interesting kind of point. Josh, we gotta figure this out, but it's okay. What did you think of the message?
Josh T.
Josh T.
That'll work. Yeah.
T-Bone?
No.
Wow.
Drawing the line.
Okay.
No, I thought it was a great message. I thought Josh really dove in to get at the root of the issue, to apply it to our giving. The simple fact of how, he explained how fear can cripple us and how it affects us, I thought was really powerful. His 3 lifestyles, I felt challenged personally. I think that those are 3 things that I absolutely wrestle with at times. So framing it in that context was actually very helpful.
Yeah. I agree. Well, so let's dive into it. Let's talk about fear just in general. And this idea, another, I thought, great idea that you kind of presented was this idea that it sort of like coexists with faith in a sense. And they're like opposing forces, but found in sort of that same realm of uncertainty and just the unknown, and how we can kind of essentially, it really is a good mirror to just our Christian walk in general. Like, are you going to choose to give into the old self, or are you going to choose to follow this new spirit? What was kind of your thoughts there when you were sort of thinking about this message and kind of getting into the ideas of like giving and fear and how that all played in?
Yeah, I think there's, how would I describe that? That's a good question. I think it is an interesting thought to me that fear and faith are very similar. It's just they're obviously on polar opposite sides of the same road, if that makes sense. Also, the more I think about it, I don't know. One of the reasons I said that, like, fear is always going to be a reality is I don't think we are supposed to live in a world that is absent of fear. I think it's like you do it afraid is basically like the mentality. It's like jump off the cliff and build your wings on the way down. Because even I think Jesus was afraid. Like, I think he was scared when he was in the garden. There's like, apparently, like, everybody wants to talk through the medical condition of bleeding while you sweat. Like, so stressed that you're sweating blood is apparently a condition that can happen. And sure, maybe that that makes sense. But at the same time, it's like he was probably like terrified of what was about to go down.
Mm-hmm.
But he went and he did it afraid. He like had his moment. He essentially took a deep breath, and then he's like, all right, this is how we're going to do this now. So I think if I were to say like, oh, you should live absent of fear, I actually don't think that's healthy.
Right.
I think it actually will cause you to do some really, really stupid things if you just decide, oh, I'm not gonna be scared of anything. It's like, well, maybe you should like pause.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, it's like that famous quote. I don't know who said it. Maybe just everybody, but it's, fear is action. Courage, sorry, is action in the face of fear, not the absence of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that clearly applies to our faith too, just because it's not that you don't have fear, it's that your trust for God is stronger than that fear.
Yeah.
And so you say, no, I trust God. So as scary as this might be, and even to go to that Jesus example, that was his ultimate prayer, right? I don't want to do this. I'm scared, nervous, just not looking forward to getting beaten and stabbed.
Yeah.
Scared or not,
Yeah.
I wouldn't want to go through that. But your will be done. And I trust, I trust you, the Father, so ultimately and so purely that I will do what is being asked of me.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing to think about, is what is being asked of you, and why are you so afraid? We've been kind of talking about this a lot in this series on the podcast here. How, it's the things that we're called to do, and like why we can so easily have faith and give our lives to God, but then when it comes to actually doing it, we sort of second guess ourselves and start thinking like, what could be so much greater that it causes you to question your faith, and how come we let that happen? I don't know if you guys have any ideas there.
Well, I just want to clarify. I think fear is important. Fear informs us. I would argue that fear is, faith is the response to fear.
Yeah.
That fear is often necessary. So I just wanted to point that piece that fear is not fear in itself is not the issue, but being crippled by fear, by not being able to follow through by acting out your faith is the issue.
Yeah. I think that's and I think you even see it. Like I know this was a message about giving, but this is why I think that giving is insanely important because it directly responds to a thing that I think every single human being deals with, which is like a financial.
Yeah.
Especially in our westernized culture, we focus so much, and I think I don't like to make general statements, but I think it's generally true that every human being is thinking about their money on some level, and it either makes you or it breaks you as our mindset, which is why I think talking about giving is so important. But even if you look at Joshua, when Moses dies, like Joshua had to be terrified of what that actually meant, because everything up to that point was kind of like this figurative thing that was going to happen at some point. Like you're going to take over from Moses at some point. Like we'll figure out a transition plan type vibe. And then Moses dies.
Yeah.
And now Joshua's got like 2 million people who really are great at complaining. And the angel comes to him and says, "Be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid." So it really is a human condition.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's like, you can live in the sake of fear, but like Josh was saying, if the fear cripples you to the point where you stop moving forward, that's a bad form of fear.
Yeah. Well, and I do think that's an important thing to think about. When you talk about money specifically, because I really like how you talk about when you were talking about the rich man and that I guess it's not a parable, that story.
Yeah.
It is so easy to say like, when God, okay, what do I do to be a Christian? It's like, well, don't murder somebody.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But that's really, I mean, for not, the majority of people, that's really against our nature. Like we don't just sit around like, man, I wish I could kill somebody.
Yeah.
But
even if it wasn't against your nature, you'd probably be able to say like, yeah, if I wanted to be good, I probably shouldn't kill people.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
But you talk about money, and like you were saying, Josh, I think it's so tied to our survival. And so it's not that I'm afraid for my life now. And how that equates to just whether, and I think as society, we've definitely elevated what is our life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, now it's, I don't have the newest smartphone and TV
Yeah.
and all this. But even at the most base level, and I think if you do go to like less wealthy countries, and you know, those people still like, we need to eat, we need food, and whether that's through money or whatever it is, like that is always the key thing. And so that fear, I think, just gets so much stronger. Josh T, you were going to say something?
Oh yeah, I guess I just saw the correlation between fear and giving, being that, you know, when we're afraid, it produces a response, and it's often a closed fist, right?
Yeah.
And giving is open because it's God's grace and blessing flowing in and through us that we can give.
Yeah.
So making those comparisons of the lifestyles that get in the way, you know, the convenience. It's really not convenient to give because of X, Y, and Z. It's easier for me to have these other things with that, you know, even with just like 10%.
Yeah.
The lifestyle of idolatry, that's very easy. There are other things that are more important, right?
Yep.
But with fear, fear restricts us from moving forward. It causes us to hold on to what is, as well as not allowing us to move forward.
Yeah.
So
That's good.
yeah.
Jordan's texting me questions.
Oh,
Awesome.
Jordan, you can use the chat.
I
but
told her to text me, but she can use the chat.
Well, let's hear it. Let's hear it. We got a Jordan question.
She sent me 3. I was gonna go with the last one. The first one was she's won this now. This last one. Is there a connection between fasting and generosity? I don't want to answer that question.
Why?
I don't know. It's just I don't want to talk about fasting. Do you feel like part of the reason why some people are not generous is because we're not willing to say no to ourselves and sacrifice our wants for what God wants?
Ooh.
Do you feel like the part of the reason why some people are not generous? So I'm not generous because I'm not willing to say no to myself and the things I want. I'm not willing to sacrifice those things for what God wants.
Yeah.
So I'm putting me first.
Yeah, I'm putting me first. Yeah, I think that's like it's got to be one of the main things I think that people will do first.
It's a form of idolatry, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's the hard part about idolatry is that it gets, if you really get down to the brass tacks of idolatry, you come away with the reality, and we don't like to hear this, I think, as Americans. Like I am one, and I like to be an American. At the bare minimum of idolatry is literally, I am nothing, God is everything. Anything outside of that is a form of idolatry. And so, yeah, I think our default is to protect me first. So I want to protect me. And I think I do think there is some wisdom in that. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there is no wisdom in it, but I will say that I do think there's some wisdom in like protecting yourself. When it comes to money, yeah, I don't know. I got to work through some of that, I think, myself, as far as what I think. But I think that if I am saying no to a generous life because I feel like I don't have enough, I think that's wrong. Yeah. I think it's actually a misrepresentation of what generosity is, because I think you're going into comparison. So now you're only basing your generosity off what you perceive culture to say is generous.
Right.
Yeah.
But for my generosity with my finances might look different than Josh's or Gordon's generosity with their finances.
Right.
God has put stuff in your hands to be generous with. So, and he's not dumb. Like God's not dumb.
Yeah.
So,
well, and I mean, at least speaking for myself, I know, I think you feel it, like that urge to give. Because I agree. I don't think, and like you were saying on Sunday, Josh, there's a lot of examples of wealthy people in the Bible. Yeah. And they did not give every single thing. They lived well.
Yeah.
But I think the key is, and I think as with everything, and you had mentioned this yesterday, like, why are you doing it? And then on top of that, what is causing you to do it?
Yeah.
And I think if you feel the prompting, and I think that's where a lot of, like you were saying, Josh T, with the closed fist, it's, well, I don't want to give that. Not that I can't necessarily. It's that, why should you get this? Or and for that not to be the natural. But at least for me, when it comes to excess giving in that sense, it
Yeah.
always just seems like the right thing to do. I don't like overthink it. It's just like, oh, I want to do this.
Yeah.
And yeah, maybe if I thought rationally, like, oh, that was more money than I should have spent right then. But I think that's where that kind of, like you were just saying, Josh, like God guides us to do things that maybe don't rationally make sense, but ultimately you realize like it was fine.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was talked that this is a heart and a soul condition, right?
Yeah.
So aligning yourself through your faith in submitting and trusting God.
Yeah.
It brings about generosity. And it's not about comparison. It's not about that, because think of you used Luke 21.
Yeah.
Right? The woman, and she put a very small amount, which would be seen in society's viewpoint, but Jesus saw her giving what she could, all she could, and he saw where her heart was. He saw where her intentions were, and where what she believed, and that was the important point that he was calling out. So I think in us, it's very easy to compare. It's very easy to even compare myself to myself.
Yeah,
I did this before. Right.
Yep.
But it's about placing your heart in the right place to answer and respond to where God is leading.
Yeah.
Which takes relationship.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. And I think too, this is kind of it's an interesting thing because, and I'm going to sort of side answer Jordan's question about fasting too, because I just think it's relevant to this point.
Okay.
I think this is why giving is so difficult, because even though the other sort of calls on the Christian life do revolve around giving something of yourself, it's different than giving a physical, like, because money in a way is sort of detached from us. I think like prayer, you can say, well, yeah, I can give 10 minutes of my time right now to pray, and it feels a little different. But money is this like external object, and to give it up, I don't know, it just seems like easier to rationalize that as something I don't have to do.
Yeah.
And then I think when you talk about fasting, it's kind of the same thing. And it also gets back to sort of that point I was making earlier about, survival, right? Fasting is in the same way giving up the stuff that you literally cannot survive without.
Yes.
And trusting God in that. And that is a huge step by comparison. I think money is seen as that huge step too, versus, oh yeah, I can pray for 10 minutes, or I can read my Bible for 5 minutes a day or something.
Yeah.
And I think that's where that fear gets to be so big. And I think this is kind of another interesting thing, and I want to get your guys' thoughts on this, because the fear that comes with giving, I think a lot of people who maybe don't give wouldn't even say they're afraid to.
It's interesting.
Yeah.
But I do think that's ultimately what it is. But it's so subversive that we don't even really realize that we're afraid.
Yeah.
And we do kind of that rationalizing or whatever. So I don't know if you guys have encountered that personally, or others have gone through that you can kind of talk to.
That's an interesting, that's an interesting point. I guess there could be, it'd be interesting if there were, I guess there could be, like followers of Jesus, people who attend church regularly who don't give just because they don't even like think about it.
Right.
That'd be wild. I feel like but yeah.
Do we talk about giving?
Yeah, maybe I guess we don't talk about it enough. Maybe like I feel like we've been preaching some pretty challenging messages that either convict you, offend you, but hopefully lead to some life change, and not just us opening our wallets, but us thinking through what are the things that are gripping my soul and how can I live a more generous life, I think is kind of the goal of the series. Yeah. Yeah.
And taking stock, because it at least looking at just like the three lifestyles, it may not be fear. It could be convenience or idolatry as well. It could be all three, right?
Yeah. 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 I think it's,
but taking stock of kind of where you're at, is kind of an important piece for this, I think.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Another question she said, I don't know if she's putting in YouTube yet.
No, nothing's coming up on YouTube.
Yeah. She says, how do you distinguish between being generous and living wisely? Both the examples I used from scripture yesterday. So are those examples of living generously? Or were those examples both the examples you used from scripture yesterday, are those examples of living generously but also wisely? That's our question. So how do you distinguish between being generous and living wisely? Yeah.
I think that's an interesting question.
Yeah.
And I think they're two totally separate things, because I think neither should impede the other, if that makes sense. I think that you should be wise with your money and save money. And I don't think, even like you were saying, Josh, yesterday, that even the story of this rich man is not about you shouldn't have money.
Yes.
Right.
It's about what owns your heart and what owns your desires.
Yes.
So I think when you think about they're really separate, they just occupy that same space. Yeah. So generosity is, I think if you like have a budget for generosity, you're already not being generous.
That's interesting.
You're doing it because you feel like you have to. This gets back to the why.
Yeah.
I think your generosity will, and God will, again, you will feel led to give to the things that you feel led to.
Yeah.
And that shouldn't cause you to go into financial ruin.
Yeah.
And so I think you can be smart with your money in that aspect, and then also be generous, and that those two shouldn't fight each other.
Yeah. And I think that, like, first of all, I do think it is wise to live generously. So I think living generously is a wise decision. And sometimes it is hard to, I think the hard part with, like James talks about earthly wisdom and heavenly wisdom, and he talks about the difference between those two things. I think he also in the same thing talks about being pure in heart and connects that to godly wisdom. And I think it's very hard for me to necessarily judge whether or not Josh or Gordon is living a wise, generous life. It is hard for me to judge that in the temporal world that we're living in. If we were in a conversation and like you had said, like, actually we don't give to the church, we don't give to like any type of thing like that. Like that to me is an unwise that's an unwise decision.
Yeah.
But if you were like, actually we give so much money away, it's ridiculous. I might in my own mind be like, wow, you guys are nuts.
Right. Yeah.
But I think people have given up a lot more in life, have said no to big things, have given up massive career paths for the sake of like the gospel. And I don't think that was an unwise choice.
Yeah.
So I think so it's hard to judge in the temporal whether or not someone being generous is unwise. Like Esther and I are always like, we'll break our budget for the sake of relationships.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's wise, but I don't think it's unwise. So
I think that the comparison of wisdom with giving, Solomon says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. And I think with our discussion of having this to do with the soul and heart, I think that something happens when we are in relationship with God and the Spirit is working through us. These things are developed, these things are grown, and wisdom will come, right? The same thing with generosity, that will come. As far as, looking back, like, have I ever given and regretted it?
Yeah.
I'm like, no, I can't think that I have.
Yeah.
Have I given to a point where it has affected my finances? Yeah. In the short term. Sure.
Yeah.
But that was a choice I made. And that's what I chose.
I would even go as far to say, like, say you gave a bunch of money to something and they just decimated how they used it.
Right.
Like, they were just completely like irresponsible with how they used the finance you gave. I still think that's why it's not about the money.
Right.
It's like, did God ask you to do this thing?
Right.
Did you do it? Who cares what happens on the other end of that dollar?
Right.
It's like, this is between you and God. In fact, I disobeyed the voice of God a few weeks ago. We were out to dinner with friends, and I it was distracting how much I felt like I needed to just take the whole bill. Like it was distracting me. And I'm watching the lady, and I was like watching the lady go up with the check with both of our credit cards. And I was like, I just need to go stop this and go pay it. And I didn't, because I was like freaked out about money. And then I was like, if it fails, like if she swipes and doesn't work, I'm gonna get up. And she swipes it, doesn't work. I was like, nah. I never did it. So living with that for a few weeks now.
If you want to if you want to get some dinner after the show, but I do think that's a really good point that you've made, and I think we talked about it one of the previous weeks, but because that's usually like the first reason somebody doesn't give. It's like, well, do you know what the church does with that money?
Yeah,
it's like we could burn it. We could take it back, in the back room and just light it on fire.
It's like, let the church deal with.
That's not what we do.
Yeah, no, of course not. But I'm just saying that's not the point.
It's like, let that institution deal with the ramifications of their misuse. It doesn't work well for people in Scripture.
Yeah, we can only steward what's ours to steward. At that point, it's the church's stewardship.
Right. Yeah,
it's between them and God, right? Yeah,
you give it to a bank with no questions.
Right. So I do think that's worth noting. It's like you're not giving for any result. You're giving because that's the call that you've had. And Jordan had a follow-up question for me. She said, so Gordon, are you saying that giving should not be a part of someone's financial budget? I don't think that is necessarily true. I think obviously you should, especially when it comes to tithing, right? Like that should be your first fruit. So that, in a sense, shouldn't be part of your budget, because your budget should start after that, if that makes sense. I am more talking, when I was kind of answering that question initially, I was talking more about, to me, like generosity is different from tithing. While tithing, I would say, is a form of giving and generosity. Yeah. When I say generosity, to answer that question, it's more like what you were saying, Josh. Like, I should pick up this bill when I'm out with friends, or I should buy my wife this more expensive whatever thing that she wants, even though I could get the cheaper one, it'd be just fine. So that is more the generosity I'm talking about. And I don't necessarily think, like you said, Josh, I think that is something that you can break a budget for, because I think the calling, and in fact, usually that's when you get asked or prompted to give those things. Yeah. Because if you're giving out of excess, then what's the point? Sorry, Josh T, go ahead.
No, you're good. I was just thinking there's nothing wrong with planning either. Like if I could set, I use very generic numbers, but if I wanted to set, say, like $100 a month in my budget for my generosity budget, or whatever you want to call it, where I can use this money to give, and that's my way of making sure that whatever. But as God works in my heart, I need to be open to things outside of that. But I would argue maybe it's not bad to have that in, but it's not okay just to leave it there. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's why I mentioned quickly. I could have talked about it more probably as like budgeting and stuff, because I think if you're not budgeting, you have no frame of reference for what does, like, that's why, like, when people say like 10%, a 10% tithe is like outlandish. It's like, well, have you ever like sat down and actually just like did your budget? Like, because if you can't live off of 90%, generally speaking, there are some things in your lifestyle that are probably too expensive. Yeah. Generally speaking, I personally am into tithing. But I would not force that on people. I think, you know what I'm saying?
Well, I think like even the verse you used on Sunday, right, which is give as you feel called to give. So I think tithing is a good practice. I don't necessarily think that 10% is kind of a holdover from the Jewish tradition.
Yeah, and you can even read stuff where it's actually more than 10%. It was like 10% of this, 10% of that.
And getting caught up on a number again, I think defeats the purpose anyway. Because it's like now you're only giving out of obligation and like giving to hit some number. So I think that
I would even go. I don't think we have time to go all the way into this stuff, because we get into the weeds with. I think that I should want to live a life where, like, I just want to pray all the time. Like, I just want to pray. Like, give me an hour. I'll go pray for an hour. Reading my Bible. Like, these are the things as a follower of Jesus that we should just, I just live and breathe this. Yeah. But generally speaking, that's not the case. Like, if you told me we're going to pray for an hour, I'm just like, man, like, really? Yeah. Like, what? But But the reality is when you start building the discipline of the thing, you truly have to force yourself. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take 10 minutes this morning. I'm going to pray. Yeah. And tomorrow I'm going to take 10 minutes and I'm going to pray. And I think the cool thing that tithing does is it forces the discipline of giving. Yeah. Like just consistent, like this is painful, but I'm going to do it. Even if it's 5%, if it's 2%, like I'm going to. I think 10%, the cool thing about 10% is it's like, it's enough for you to understand that it's happening, but it's not so much that you feel like, holy cow, like what am I going to do for fun now?
Right.
So that's why I think that 10% should be like your, for the average person, that should be the end point. But if you start at 1%, it's building a discipline of consistently doing something over and over again. And you'll find in the same way prayer actually does work and reading scripture does work, like giving, there's something about it.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say, when you give, it changes your heart, right?
Yeah.
There's something that happens there when you're in relationship as well.
Yeah. I've never met someone who listened to at the dinner table and was like, I'm going to take the bill, who was like upset after that they did it. Like, I'm more upset that they didn't do it. Because now I don't have a good generosity story. I have a good story about disobeying the voice of God. Yeah. So, yeah.
Well, yeah. And, I think, like you said, praying, giving is a spiritual discipline, and all of those things are like muscles,
Yeah, exactly.
You obviously, if you've never lifted a weight before, you're not going to go in the gym and like throw 500 pounds on the bar, right? You start, but the more you work at it, the more comfortable it gets, the easier it gets, and it does change you. And I think, I think the more that you grow in all of these spiritual disciplines, you will have a whole new perspective on yourself, on others, on just everything as you get closer.
Yeah, and we serve a God who is faithful, so He will walk with us as we take those steps. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that's what's just so amazing about it is that it's not only just modeled, but He's with us.
Yeah, and it's like if you do struggle with these things, like He's not oblivious to the fact that you struggle with it. Mm-hmm. He's like just grateful that you're starting to realize it.
In fact, that's something you can pray about.
Yeah, exactly.
Brought it full circle.
That's the work.
Josh, I know you have to get going, but Carrie did throw a question up in the chat. So if we don't have time for this, I understand. But she said, can you discuss consumerism versus being a contributor when it comes to finances?
Oof. Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, Carrie. So I'm just glad you're just
thanks, Carrie,
bringing up easy topics to tackle in a couple minutes. But there's so much that we could say about consumerism and I
think it both points to the heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think consumerism, right, is like the ultimate form of idolatry, at least in this realm that we're talking about. Because how many times do you buy something and then think like, I didn't need to buy this, like 5 minutes after you have it, or and I think that's where that comes from. It's trying to fill the void that like God wants to fill. Yeah. And instead of trusting Him, I think that's the prime example of like fear pushing you into this negative way of being. Yeah. Because instead of saying, yes, I'm going to trust God, you say, no, I'm afraid. I'm going to go to this for like comfort. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But now I have it. I don't have money. I am no happier with this item. Yeah. Versus like contributing. I do think, again, when it comes to giving, it's like you are giving to God. Yeah. Ultimately, even if it is just buying your friend dinner when you go out, like it's not just about tithing to the church. Yeah. You really are, and this comes with that refocus, right? Everything for God and understanding that God is shining through you through that giving. And that is what the contribution is. The contribution is not financial. Yeah. The contribution is spiritual, just using the avenue of finances. Yeah.
Often when we consume, it's about us. Giving is about others.
Consuming is like literally baked into like, what can I get out of this?
Right. And focus is me or my needs. Yeah. Whereas giving is just others.
Yeah. It's a coddled version of Christianity, which I think is destructive because it's hard to live on mission with something if you are just constantly consuming and you're not contributing to it.
Yes.
And because I think it's a misrepresentation of the gospel as well, because the whole point of the gospel is that you have a part to play. Right. And if you have the mentality of like, what's in this for me, I think that's the antithesis of gospel living.
Mhm.
I think the whole thing is like, as my response is X, Y, and Z, and it's just reasonable according to Paul that I respond with my whole life. Yeah.
And again, God's promise to take care of those needs.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
So
Yeah.
that's the faith piece. Ties
Yeah.
right back to faith.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Cool.
All right.
All right.
Awesome.
You guys got any last thoughts? Yeah, thank you both for joining us.
No, I wish I would have talked more about the woman and the two mites, because I loved that. I love that story.
Yeah.
That's where I thought you were going initially.
I know. I
and
did
then
that on
you
purpose.
pivoted into the rich
Yeah,
man.
I
I was
did
like,
that on
oh, he got me.
purpose. Yeah. Because I knew when I started talking about the money thing and the temple,
Yeah.
people would have thought the woman with the two mites. But
Well, it
I
worked.
wanted to set the stage that everybody in the culture knew about those things as well. And so the rich man would have been thinking about those things. Jesus was always thinking about those 13 boxes. So it was very culture. I kind of brought us into the culture with
Yeah.
that. And then, I ended with her because they're a very good dichotomy between each other, which I think is cool.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Well, thank you both for joining us. Thank you all for watching. Thank you for the comments here on the chat. We will be back next week with another episode of Beyond the Message. We'll be back this Sunday with church. And Wednesday, we got prayer Wednesday night, 6 o'clock here at the Prayer Chapel. Friday night's youth. Church, have a great week. We will see you next week. Be blessed.